Great to see so many names, familiar and some new. And thank you so much for joining us today for one of these live Project Lunchtime seminars. And happy Women in Science Day to any of you women who are in science. So I will just do the quick housekeeping. So just to say that the webinar is being recorded, but it's only recording us, the panelists. It's not recording you guys as attendees. We'll start off with Jane giving her presentation, and we really hope that there'll be lots of questions and nice comments. So if you have them as we're going along, feel free to pop them into the chat at the bottom of the screen, or the Q&A. If you are using the chat, please just make sure that you're sending the messages to everyone, not just to Jane, because it's hard for her to keep, apologies for my dog in the background, I'll mute in a second. It's hard for her to keep track of comments while she's presenting. So if you make sure that your comments are coming to all of us, we'll help her out at the end. And at the end, if you'd like to make a comment or ask a question in person, you can do that as well. We'll let you know how to do that. But for now, I'm going to introduce Dr. Fidelma Butler, who's one of the leads on the LIFE project, to give us a little bit of background to what Jane is doing. And then Jane will kick off. So over to you guys.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. And yeah, welcome to everyone, and great to see so many for today's seminar. So, you know, the LIVE project really focuses on natural capital, and in particular, the natural capital of this place down here in Iveragh. And, you know, natural capital, we think about flora and fauna and geology, all those kind of, you know, as we say, biotic and abiotic things. But of course, people are one of the most important components of natural capital. People of the present, and they're the people that live here, and the people working on this project, and of course all the women working on this project, and also people of the past. And so that is what you are going to hear about today. And you know, as I said here yesterday, you know, you'll hear one woman in science talking about another woman in science. And of course, we're very fond of Maude Delap in UCC and here in the School of Bees, because we have called one of our prizes, we give a prize to postgraduates for the best seminar or for the best publication every year, and we have called that prize after Maude Delap in honor of her. So I'm delighted to introduce Jane Sheehan to you. Jane is working on the LIFE project, and she is focusing on jellyfish, but also on Maude. And actually, I'll just let Jane tell you more about Maude. She's just much more in tune with Maude. So take it away, Jane.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks for that introduction, Lucy and Fidelma. Hopefully everyone can hear me. I am just going to go share my screen, so if everybody can let me know that they can see it. Yeah, all good?
That's good. Yeah, lovely, Jane.
Brilliant. So thank you so much to everyone who's joined today. It's great to have so many people interested to learn more about Maude Delap, and especially on International Day of Women and Girls in Science. Like Fidelma said, I'm a knowledge gatherer as part of the LIFE project, and I suppose I'm really honoured to be able to research someone as important as Maude Delap. So I think, I think it's, you know, to start with, you know, who was Maude Delap. I think one thing that really shocked me about her narrative was the fact that I've grown up in Kerry. I've lived in Kerry my entire life. I went to school in Kerry and college in Kerry, and I had never heard of Maude Delap. I only heard of her a couple of years ago, and when I did, I was just completely blown away by this concept that Ireland has this pioneer jellyfish researcher. I just thought it was amazing, and I also was just so shocked I had never heard of her before. Obviously, she's very celebrated within local communities and on Valentia Island and in Iveragh. And I do believe there's a lot of authors, artists, poets, and scientists who commemorate her work and celebrate her, but I suppose not on this kind of larger, wider scale. So I just think she needs to be kind of, she needs to be celebrated, you know, in a very national sense, and especially within Kerry and Iveragh. So I suppose starting with the question, who is Maude Delap? Well, you know, she moved with her family to Valentia Island in 1874. So she was born in 1866, And they originally came from Donegal. Her father was the Reverend in Templeton Rectory. And so he was actually appointed to the parish of Valentia Island and of Cahersiveen. So he moved the family down there, and they actually took up residence inside the parsonage. So you can see this lovely headed paper here from one of their letters. It shows that they were living in the parsonage in the middle of Knightstown on Valentia Island. And they actually, the family came by rail, so they down on the railway to Cahersiveen, and there still was one. But her father actually sailed down the coast with their belongings on a boat. And I suppose, you know, we've included these pictures and of Valentia in relation to Ireland is, I suppose that it's really important to kind of take in the remoteness of Valentia in Maude Delap's story. It was quite a westerly, remote island, and at the time there was no connection between Valentia and Portmagee as there is now with the land bridge. So you could really only get there by boat. But I suppose to start, I'd like to talk about her father a bit, Alexander H. Delap. Like I said, he was a reverend on Valentia Island, and I suppose he was very, very interested in wildlife and nature, and he began corresponding with the keeper of the Natural History Museum in Dublin back early in the 1800s. Kind of, I suppose he was very, very interested in wildlife, and he enjoyed wanting to find out more. So he was constantly writing, kind of almost on like a quest for knowledge, identification of species. Sometimes he just sent information of things he saw birds doing or insects doing, and he just wanted more information or to update the Natural History Museum of what was happening around him. And sometimes he liked to send specimens as well. So it's clear that he's very, very interested in kind of his natural environment, but he's also very interested in the marine. Like I said, he was a sailor. He used to do quite a lot of sailing himself around the waters of Valentia, and it's actually said that he was very proud to have the skelligs in his parish, and that him and Maude would actually row out to the skelligs together and make some observations of kind of some seabirds and stuff around there. And I think there's actually a lovely quote by the Bishop of Limerick on Alexander Delap. He called him "my old man of the sea." So I think, you know, Alexander really, really instilled this passion of wildlife onto all of his children, not only just Maude, but onto her sister Constance, and also her brothers George and Alfred, who both wrote to the Natural History. All three of them wrote to the Natural History Museum as well. George actually wrote while he was away as part of a doctor for the Navy, and he sent a bird back from Russia. So they're obviously just really, really interested on this kind of quest for knowledge about, you know, wildlife and biology. But unfortunately at the time it was kind of seen that the men were kind of prioritized for going to school. So Maude herself and her sisters didn't actually receive a formal education. They were homeschooled, and I suppose it's probable that their father, you know, really, really kind of schooled them on wildlife and nature and science. And Maude really picked up on this and became really interested in kind of the flora and fauna of Valentia Island. And I suppose she kind of started a correspondence as well with the Natural History Museum, a very regular correspondence. I mean, here's some lovely examples of this lovely postcard she sent there from Valentia to the museum, and some lovely letters as well, which are all available in the archives in the Natural History Division of the museum. And she also would send specimens as well. So here's an example of some of the specimens that are preserved in their wet collection in the Natural History Museum. So she would send things by rail up to the museum. And here's just another example, I think that's fantastic, of a Kemp's Ridley turtle that she sent. It's still perfectly preserved in the archives. And so she would get people would come to her, and if they found something rare and unusual, like the man who found this turtle thought it was a crab, and he really wanted to know more about it. So Maude sent back to see if she could, you know, tell him more about it and give him the information back. But her and the keeper decided, well, if I give you, you know, so many shillings for this, you give that back to the keeper, and at least that way then it kind of encourages people to bring you stuff. So they were almost trying to encourage a sense of like citizen science within the community, which I think is really, really great. And again, this is just a lovely example of, you know, specimens that her and her family sent 100 years ago. They're all still there. then they're all still being very well preserved within the museum. So it's great to see that. Again, this is a veined squid. I just think it's a very cool photo to show. But I suppose a lot of Maude's research kind of really kicks off when the Royal Irish Academy and University College London decided to carry out a study of the Valentia Harbour and the waters around it. They believed because it was so westerly that there would be something really unusual in the water, and it was headed by this man Edward T. Brown, and he was really interested in plankton and jellyfish. And one of the other reasons that they wanted to come to Valentia is they heard about this amazing family of naturalists, obviously the Delaps, and you can actually see here, so he submitted his findings of his survey in a journal called The Fauna and Flora of Valentia Harbour on the west coast of Ireland. And here are just some lovely paragraphs from the start when he says, "The Reverend A. Delap and Mrs. Delap gave us all a hearty welcome, and a great part of our success is due to their advice and kindness." And then he goes on to say about Maude and Constance that they had gave them invaluable assistance and their work is recorded in most of his reports. So he goes on to really acknowledge their help. He says that the Mrs. Delap most willingly continued the tow nettings after our departure. So they carried on his work once he left. And he said that they continued to send him things. So over 100 bottles of general tow net material have been sent to me, in addition to numerous bottles containing delicate animals. So obviously the Delaps were of a great assistance to them and really helped them out. And then continued plankton surveys. So Maude Delap actually carried out extensive plankton surveys during her lifetime. I think before we go into the surveys, it's always important to kind of say, like, what are plankton? Not everybody is familiar with plankton. It's something quite small and quite cryptic at times, but planktos is the Greek to drift or to wander, and that's kind of what plankton are. They're organisms that drift and float on our water's currents, and plankton can be as big as something like a classic jellyfish, or as small as the microscopic plankton that you can see on screen here. It's just to give a bit of reference, something the size is half of the width of a strand of hair. So plankton are really important to our marine environment. Why we would want to study them is because a lot of things eat plankton. They're a very important part of the food chain. So, you know, they're very indicative of the overall health of the ocean. And without plankton, the ecosystem would fall apart. So it's really important for us to kind of carry out these plankton surveys and carry out time series. So like I said, she carried out extensive plankton surveys between 1895 and 1923. In 1895 and 1896, she would have been mostly helping Edward Brown, and she would have been doing this with her sister Constance. They would have rowed out into the Valentia Harbour and in a small little brown punt, and they used to have a little tow net, and they would tow it beside the boat. So you can kind of see in the little kind of graphic there what they would have been doing. And how a plankton net works is as the water goes through the net, it catches the planktonic material, and then you would take this net out and you would sieve some water through it, and you'd be left with your plankton. So after Edward Brown went back to University College London, Maude and Constance continued doing this, and they continued carrying out these surveys, and then they would bring their plankton. So they would bring their plankton back into the laboratory they had made. Maude called it the department. She coined her own term for her self-made laboratory, and she'd bring them back there to work on them. And there's just a lovely quote from one of her relatives where they said the department was described as a heroic jumble of books, specimens, and aquaria, and that it had a pervasive low tide smell. And yeah, so Maude would have brought these specimens back to her department, and she would have put them under a microscope so that she could observe, identify, and analyze them. So like I said, they're very small, and their details are very hard to kind of identify. It requires a lot of time and patience, even in modern day plankton analysis. They're quite difficult to view under a microscope sometimes due to being so small. And especially for the jellyfish or the gelatinous zooplankton, they can be very see-through. And this is actually her lovely golden microscope, which is on display in Valentia Island Heritage Centre. So if you go to their exhibition on Maude Delap, you're actually able to see this wonderful microscope and the box that it came in. But here's just like a really lovely example of plankton. These photos were taken by the Plankton Club in UCC, and here we can kind of see what Maude Delap would have been seeing down her microscope. These are pictures taken with a very fantastic microscope and camera. So you can see that there's a lovely details that you can make out of these small kind of gelatinous species. So these species here, little gelatinous sea plankton, and here we can kind of see a range of size, because some of these are microscopic, but this picture, second from the left, is actually, it's a comb jellyfish, and it's something you could see swimming around the water. So this is just a nice idea of kind of the small intricate details you'd be seeing under a microscope. And you can see that Maude Delap was obviously able to replicate what she was seeing in her drawings as well. She was a great artist. She obviously had a very fine attention to detail and a great eye, because this picture she drew here of Sarsia geminifera on the right, this is a species of kind of smaller jellyfish. And you can see that she's even actually captured that it was cloning off. So one of the ways that jellyfish can reproduce is by budding or cloning themselves. And to see that she was able to capture this, like not only under the microscope, but draw it as well, is fantastic. And here on the left, you can actually see it's a bit cut out, but she's got like notes on the color, she's got notes on the number of appendages. And so I think she had like a lot of patience and a great attention to detail, which definitely would have helped her. And this is actually the sketchbook that's available to view in the Valentia Island Heritage Centre. But I think most of us know Maude Delap from her interest in jellyfish. So like I said, she stayed corresponding with Edward Brown. They actually corresponded for over 40 years together when he left. But they corresponded back and forth, and he was very interested in jellyfish. So it's very possible that they, you know, encouraged each other to study more. And like I said, she at this time, she started being very interested in the concept of culturing jellyfish. So getting jellyfish to reproduce or to breed in situ, so in a lab or in an aquarium. And I suppose it's worth taking into considering that like breeding jellyfish is a very difficult task. It requires a lot of patience. It requires special requirements. Even today, you know, people who work in jellyfish exhibits often say, you know, how like it's a very perfect science. So you can imagine back in 1800s, end of the 1800s, started in the 1900s, they definitely would have found it difficult. So there was a lot of scientists at the time who were struggling to kind of keep jellyfish alive. Majority of people were looking at jellyfish for histology studies and studies of neurology. So they were actually hoping to see if they could keep their jellyfish alive much longer for the experiments they were carrying out. And not many people were having a lot of success. A lot of people were seeing them die off after a few days. And it's the same with Edward Brown. So he actually, when he went back to Plymouth, he started wondering how to culture jellyfish as well. And if you read his journal on keeping Medusa alive in an aquarium, he talks about how little success he was having. And he eventually kind of figured out it's because an aquarium doesn't have a tide in it. So how he decided to overcome this is he created this bell jar with a glass plunger, and it basically would simulate the tide, so it used to circulate the water. But even then, I think he said that with this glass plunger, he was only really keeping jellyfish alive for around 10 days. So then, yeah, Maude too became very interested in the concept of culturing jellyfish. She would bring them in from the shore or carry them. So she would find them on the shore and bring them back to the lab, or she would actually just pick them up with bell jars when she was out on her boat. And like I said, she'd bring them back and she'd put them into a little bell jar or an aquarium. This is a lovely modern day depiction of jellyfish in a bell jar. I'm sure Maude's were less sophisticated than that, but what she would do is she would put the jellyfish in the jar, and then she would change the water daily. So she would go out and she'd add more fresh salt water into it, and she'd also measure the temperature outside in the harbour and then test the temperature in her tank, and she would constantly be regulating her aquarium to make sure that it was at the exact same temperature. And she would also just monitor daily changes, and her journals really focus on that. You can see the constant kind of progress within all of the tanks. But I suppose one of the most important things about Maude Delap culturing jellyfish was that she really paid attention to jellyfish diet, which wasn't really a thing at the time. people hadn't really gone into much detail when it came to jellyfish diet, whereas she kind of did it on a process of trial and error. She would go out and she would collect plankton, again, out in her boat into the harbour. She'd tone it for plankton. She'd bring them back and then she'd put them into the tank. And she would just watch and see what the jellyfish preferred. And it's actually quite lovely reading her notes. She talks about like jellyfish which gorged on one type of plankton, or he didn't touch another type of plankton type thing. And again, this hadn't really been done at the time. But one of the loveliest things I heard about kind of Maude Delap culturing jellyfish was from a relative of hers who said that when she was asked how she circulated the water in the tank, because like I said, Edward Brown was creating this very complicated looking plunger jar. She said that Maude smiled and she turned her hand. So she must have been just turning the water, circulating the water with her hand, which I think is really fantastic. But I think always when we talk about breeding jellyfish, it's really important to kind of get an idea how complex the jellyfish life cycle is. It's kind of why it's so difficult to breed jellyfish, is that they have this strange life cycle with many steps. So just to start, I mean, when you're out in the water, I think everyone's familiar with your typical bell-shaped jellyfish, like behind me. That's your adult medusa, and when it wants to reproduce, it will produce a planula, which is a small egg that kind of looks like a furry tic tac, and this will float along and it will find itself a nice surface to kind of stick onto. And this is when it develops into the polyp. And I like to say that a polyp is kind of like a hand with tentacles on it. And these kind of polyps would stick out from the surface, and they would begin to feed and grow and become the budding polyp. And the budding polyp just kind of looks like the polyp with a lot of appendages on top. And when the time is right, the budding polyp will liberate or bud off these tiny little Ephirae, which are essentially just kind of small juvenile baby jellyfish. And the Ephirae will swim away and grow and develop until you get your classic bell-shaped jellyfish again. So a bit of a complex life cycle, and something to note is that it can actually go backwards as well. So like I said, if the conditions aren't right, the budding polyp will actually revert back to the polyp, and it will stay in that stage until it finds the right conditions, which could be greater supply of nutrients, or better water conditions, better temperature. And I suppose when we talk about Maude Delap culturing jellyfish, it's really important to note that she was culturing all these stages. She had many of polyps and many budding polyps, and then she had many Ephirae. But in 1901, she became one of the first people in the world to successfully breed jellyfish and documented it. At the time, nobody had really published on rearing jellyfish before. And she was definitely the first person to kind of document this whole process and give her kind of scientific reasonings on what she'd done. Like I said, there's a lot of information in those journals about what the jellyfish ate and what was happening to them at every stage and their growth and all that. But essentially, she went out in 1901, she got an injured compass jellyfish, brought it back in, or in 1900, and a year later, she had a brand new compass jellyfish. I think several brand new compass jellyfishes grown from the original. And like I said, this is really important, not only because it helped us understand the jellyfish life cycle, but at the time, people weren't really sure if this was a different species to this, or this was a different species to this. So it really helped kind of clarify that like this was all part of the one cycle, which would have been a very big deal at the time. And again, the focus on diet was quite monumental. Because nobody had really looked at diet before, they began to kind of implement that in future studies of breeding jellyfish. And there's actually another wonderful woman in marine science, Marie Labor, who worked in Plymouth Marine Biological Station, and she wasn't having success breeding jellyfish. She wanted to raise jellyfish so she could see if they ate fish, which is kind of a hypothesis she said. And when she heard about Maude Delap's kind of study of diet and jellyfish culturing, she added that together with Edward Brown's plunger, and that's when she got like success breeding jellyfish. So Maude really was kind of it was kind of like a start to the whole culturing jellyfish, and a manual. It's kind of our first manual on how we can go about breeding jellyfish. And of course, she aquacultured 4 different species which are native to Irish waters. So back there, the moon jellyfish, the blue jellyfish, the mauve stinger, and the compass jellyfish. And she actually published them in papers under her own name. So Maude Delap published 6 articles during her time and 3 short notes, and they were all under her own name. And actually 2 of her plankton journals included Constance's name, which is really great because I think she was an invaluable help to Maude, especially going out and rowing with her. But yeah, so she did 3 journals on plankton and then 3 journals on jellyfish. And then these 3 little short notes, which are kind of observations that she'd seen around Valentia. And then here you can just see some of the lovely drawings she did and she submitted as part of her journal for the culturing of the blue jellyfish. And she just depicted the different life stages. But yeah, another thing that Maude Delap is kind of known for is her discovery of the burrowing sea anemone. So that's what it looks like there on the left. They're a very, very small species. Very tiny. But basically, for anyone who knows Valentia and knows Knightstown, she was out rowing down out near the waterfront where the Ornalai slipway pier is at the moment. And just off that pier, she found the burrowing sea anemone in her tow net. And it was unlike anything else that had been described before. And that's when, she discovered this burrowing sea anemone. And I suppose it was named after her afterwards by Thomas Allen Stevenson, and he named it Edwardsia Delapiae in her honor. There was several Edwardsia sea anemones at the time, but it was Delapiae that got named after her. And in his book, The Sea Anemones of the British Isles, he went on to say that Maude had a real talent for kind of finding and skill and persistence for finding rare species. And what's really, really cool about Edwardsia Delapiae is it's not found anywhere else in the world, and it's only found in Valentia Harbour. And so it's really cool that she found something that is just specific to Valentia, and it's named after her. Its distribution has changed. It was surveyed in the last 20 years, and it's not quite at the pier anymore. It's further out into the harbour, but it's still there to this day, which is fantastic. And I know we said earlier that, look, we don't really recognise her on a large national level, but I think it's really important to note that she was well recognised in the science community. I think people really acknowledge the work she'd done. In 1906, I suppose, after 2 of her jellyfish and 2 of her plankton articles had been published, she got acknowledged by the Marine Biological Association in Plymouth, and they offered her a fellowship, which is a significant honour now. So you can imagine what the significant honour was at the time. So that was in 1906, and unfortunately, despite her father being nurturing all along the way in her kind of her research, he obviously didn't really want her to leave, because it's reported that he said, "No daughter of mine will leave this house until she's married," which is a pity, because Maude could have gone on and had probably a very promising career as a marine biologist in Plymouth Marine Laboratory. But I suppose it's worth taking into consideration her father actually died that year in 1906, so he might have been very ill, and Maude would have been 40 at the time, and all the men had actually moved out of the house. It was just her and her sisters, and after their father died, they actually had to be gifted a new house because they had to leave the original parsonage. And they survived off of Maude's ability. She was also an amazing gardener. Her ability to grow wonderful flowers and sell them. So perhaps she felt it was her duty to stay with her sisters. I suppose what's most important is, her father didn't force her to marry and didn't force the sisters to marry. And they got to continue researching, I suppose, and carrying out research to the end of Maude's life in 1953. And another way she was honoured was she was made an honorary associate of the Linnean Society, which would be a group of esteemed scientists working on taxonomy and evolutionary biology in 1936. And after her death in 1953, they actually published an obituary for her in the Irish Naturalist Journal. which is lovely because she actually published a couple of papers in the Irish Naturalist Journal. And it's actually a 3-page obituary with a picture. It's actually quite lovely if you get a chance to read it sometime. But there was just one sentence in it that really, really struck me. Every worker on Irish natural history is indebted to her for her help most generously given. And I think when we speak about Maude Delap, you know, we get caught up in trying to figure out what her main contributions were and her scientific findings. But I suppose what I find most striking about her is just her effort, the amount of effort she would have been putting in, rowing and towing and spending hours and in her laboratory kind of conducting these experiments for want and love of knowledge. I think that's something that really needs to be highlighted when we talk about her. But I mean, she was an absolutely fantastic person. I think she's a trailblazer and an inspiration for women in STEM. And I do think that she really needs to be remembered and her legacy shouldn't be forgotten. So I suppose the next question is, how do we protect and promote her legacy? I suppose there's a lot of information out there about her, but it's just kind of scattered between different institutions, museums, colleges. You know, it's all about kind of finding this information and making a definitive list of where all this information is, kind of identifying what's missing, and just kind of cataloging this and bringing this together with what existing knowledge we have of Maude Delap. And I think once we bring that together and we're able to share it with people and share it with the public so that people can know more about her, that's definitely a way that we can protect her legacy. But also, I think, you know, trying to get in contact with people who might have memories of Maude Delap, maybe family members told them stories of Maude Delap, maybe you have photos of Maude Delap or letters. So contacting people who would have any information or have any relation to her is definitely part of protecting and promoting her legacy. But I suppose what's really important, I think, to me is making the science and the research she did transparent and understandable and accessible, because I think, you know, plankton, something very cryptic, something we can't see, something a lot of people don't think of often, and jellyfish, you know, something kind of strange and unusual, and especially when you think of their complex life cycle, that's something we need to make understandable to people, kind of make that science, you know, just to show how important the science is. We really need to be able to understand it on all levels. And I really think once we understand the importance of jellyfish and plankton as well within our environment, then we can kind of, you know, start to understand the importance of her contributions and protect her legacy. So I suppose there's, on top of those things that I plan to hopefully do as part of my role as knowledge gatherer, I hope to kind of contact people and reach out to institutions and begin gathering this kind of list and cataloging what I can. Also in the coming months, we plan to do like a little bit more science, so possibly getting out and doing some plankton sampling in Valentia Harbour, because I think it would be really lovely to kind of keep up seeing plankton work, especially in Valentia, and keep that kind of survey going. It's really important to get time series of plankton communities. As I said, that's how we kind of see how our ocean health is. And I think a visual catalogue of the plankton would be really lovely, because they're such cryptic species, and just to be able to see them with your own eyes kind of brings into like the importance of them and how interesting they are. And especially it would be lovely to see the species that Maude Delap would have seen down her microscope. And similar to this, you know, I'd love to carry out some shore surveys of jellyfish on Iveragh, to just see their distribution and what species are turning up where. Again, keeping jellyfish research alive on Iveragh, and I suppose producing a lot more educational resources. I'd like to see more resources around jellyfish and plankton and Maude Delap herself, because like I said, understanding them and understanding her is how we start to celebrate her. And I suppose in kind of more recent, we've developed a heritage trail, which is kind of an interactive trail that you can see online at the moment. We have a story map up, but we're also hoping to do a walking tour of that. So the walking tour is expected to be on the 26th of March. Unfortunately, the official details haven't been released of it yet, but I think the event details should be available from next week onwards. But just to let people know that we are planning on doing a walking trail on Valentia Island, we kind of look at the various points of interest in Maude's life and talk about a bit about her kind of in her locality. And of course, there's just another thing to keep a lookout for is I had the honor of going to the Natural History Museum and looking at the archives in the Natural History Division. And I got to photograph some of the correspondence between Delaps and the keeper of the museum. And I suppose I've been posting little updates of transcribing the letters. As you saw a couple of slides ago of the Delap letters, they do not have the easiest handwriting, so it takes a bit of time. But it's a nice way to kind of share not only the personality of all of the Delaps, but even here you get like the little scientific information where she's talking about, you know, hatching eggs and getting them to swim in a tank of, she's talking about Valela here, which is the by the wind sailor. So you get a little glimpse of what Maude was up to. And I've been tweeting this under the hashtag finding Maude Delap. So you can go and follow that on Twitter and you'll get all of the updates of things that I think that are of interest about Maude Delap. And hopefully, yeah, I'll be posting more about her in the future. But I suppose there's also an element that where you can help find Maude Delap. So like I said, if anyone has photos, letters, stories, even memories of Maude Delap, like please reach out to the Live Project. It's so important. Again, I'm not a historian and I don't claim to know everything about Maude Delap. I actually really appreciate people reaching out to me and talking to me about her, because you know, I'm more so looking at kind of why we should celebrate her because of her amazing science contributions. Like I've really used the help of other people on this, and please feel free to contact me through my own email or through the live email. But also we're very proud to announce that our webpage on Maude Delap has actually gone up on our website. So it's www.ecomuseumlive.eu, and there's a special page for finding Maude Delap. And we have some nice content up there at the moment, but I'm really looking forward to kind of adding more to it in the coming months. So look, thank you very much for listening to me today. It's been an absolute honor to be able to talk about someone as inspirational to me as Maude Delap, and especially on Women and Girls in Science Day. It's just absolutely fantastic. And I'm really looking forward to what more we can do with this project as time goes on. And yeah, if you have any questions, feel free to either ask me at the end of this presentation or follow up with me again. And yeah, here's just some of our links to our social media. And all of the other wonderful knowledge gatherers I work with are all working on all equally fascinating projects. So please go check them out as well. Yeah.
Thanks so much, Jane. Well done. The chat is pretty busy with compliments and nice words, so well done.
Thank you.
We have some inspiring and enjoyable and wonderful, so well done.
I could keep talking about Maude Delap forever.
Yeah, lovely comments from Joe McGill, who of course has the Maude Delap beer.
Wonderful beer.
We have got a question from Christina about Edwardsia Delapia. I don't know if you know the answer to this, Jane. I certainly haven't read it, but do you know if there's any suggestion as to why there's been a change in where you can find the Edwardsia Delapia anemone?
I don't know. I can only assume probably human activity. I know it's found more towards the islands in the harbour, but I actually don't know, Christina. It's definitely something I'd love to see more. I'd love to see people surveying Edwardsia and more information on it, because it's just really special to have something that rare and related to Maude Delap, you know, in Kerry and in the harbour in Valentia. So it's definitely something that I think is worth investigating at some point.
Yeah. We don't have that many things, I suppose, that are unique to Ireland. So yeah. There's a few questions there about whether there's any evidence that she was aware of or inspired by Ellen Hutchins, who would have been a little bit before her time. But
I actually I'm not sure. Again, I've really only been reading her correspondence to the keeper of the Natural History Museum. So a lot of that is very specific to species and wildlife. And there's not a lot of personal elements in the sense that I get to learn a bit more about what really inspired her. Because I think that's something that's really interesting to me as well, is who was she inspired by, especially someone as amazing as Ellen Hutchins. But also just what I like, obviously Edward Brown coming over really, really inspired her to work with jellyfish, but I just love to know that she had that passion beforehand. Somebody asked me the last day, when did her interest in marine biology start? And I was like, do you know what, I don't know. And I think that would be really fascinating to find out, is it something she was doing from a very young age? Again, these are all just the questions I'd love to be able to answer. But until we get those kind of archives together, it's not really sure.
Yeah. We have a question here then, wondering, did Maude correspond with any naturalists in Wales?
I don't know, but often in her correspondence she speaks of many other people, often in the UK as well. So I think there was like a Dr. Bodler, who was an ornithologist in the UK. So it's definite that she was corresponding with a lot of people. Unfortunately, a lot of her correspondence was taken from the house when she died. And again, that's kind of scattered between, I think, the Natural History Museum in London and within Plymouth. So I'm not actually sure who else she was corresponding with. But in her letters, there's an odd mention to a couple of different doctors that, she must have also contacted about kind of things that she was interested in or wanted to know more about. So unfortunately, I actually don't know if she was contacting anyone in Wales, but it would be lovely to find out.
Yeah. I suppose, we've had a lot of conversations about this, Jane, in the last few weeks about what enabled someone like Maude to be able to work in science to some extent. It wasn't an official job, but to be able to spend her life studying and answering all these scientific questions. You're a great woman in science, and we're here as well, the project represented by our PI, Fidelma. So obviously it's not entirely unusual for there to be women looking at these kinds of topics in natural sciences. What are the things that you maybe have found personally that are most inspiring, or do you think you have maybe in common with Maude, or are very different, these days to in her time? Is there anything that stands out?
I guess, because I suppose originally when I started learning about Maude Delap, and especially I think you hear that comment from her father all the time, everywhere you look, and it's obviously, it's definitely sad, but I suppose she was very, very lucky to have had a very encouraging family, and a family who were all interested in wildlife, regardless of where they went. Her brother was an engineer in Waterford. I think he helped build some famous bridge or something like that, but he was still corresponding. So she obviously had a very, very, kind of a nice family setting to kind of do what she wanted to do and what she was passionate about. So it has definitely got me to see kind of her story through different eyes. It's definitely that she had she was lucky to be able to kind of carry out her research. We don't know about things in common, but I definitely think that one of the things that I really think is important to take away from this story is her perseverance, because like you said, she wouldn't have had she would have had means in the sense that like she was very lucky that her father was the rector and they had the use of the house, and that obviously brought in money for them. But after he died, they had to leave the rectory and the parsonage, and the Knight of Kerry actually gifted them Green Ellen House. So that's kind of the house you would go to see on Valentia Island if you wanted to see where Maude Delap lived. They were gifted this house, and Maude and the sisters, they lived solely off of her selling like flowers in her garden. So they were said to have a very austere lifestyle, and they were almost like kind of ridiculed in the village for wearing old Victorian clothes. So it's very aware that they just didn't care about what they looked like or money. They were very interested in just carrying out their science and their research. And I think that's, Maude was just so devoted to her passions, and she really persevered and put in all this effort. And I think that's like one of the most fascinating things about her, is she just loved it so much. She did it all the time.
Yeah. Great. There's lots of other really nice comments in the chat. Something about Green Ellen House, which unfortunately is still looking pretty abandoned, and I don't think there's any plan to turn it into the museum that you suggest, Janet, but it would be lovely.
Yeah.
If there are no other questions, I hand over for the last words to you, Fidelma, and let everyone else go and get their lunch.
Great, thanks, Lucy. And Jane, thank you so much. I mean, we've spoken about Jane or about Maude before, but you have really brought her to life, you know, and brought the work that she's done to life. So fantastic talk. Thanks very much. And just, I suppose, to echo what you said there about her interest and her perseverance. And I also just that element of curiosity. I mean, that's the most, I suppose, the most inspiring thing really, isn't it? Is that curiosity is satisfying one's own curiosity. And that's what makes, well, as far as I believe anyway, it's what makes science so interesting, and it's what makes people scientists or want to be scientists, is just to pursue their own curiosity. So so thank you, Jane. A fantastic talk. Really enjoyed it, and look forward to, you know, all of the new stuff you're going to uncover and discover, and encourage everyone who's interested in Maude and in Jane's work, you know, to look at the live website. Lots of information to be put up there, and lots of more things to come, I guess. So thanks very much for attending, and just keep an eye on the events page for other lunchtime seminars that are coming up in the future.
Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.